Before the trip began, Lauren gave me a shell that she got from Cape Henlopen. She told me to return it when I got to the ocean. On Thursday, June 12th, Dano showed up around 5:30. I packed up the car, put my boat on top, we headed over to Josh's, got his boat, and loaded up the back of the Subaru. Dano then drove us to Deposit, New York. In Deposit, we came upon a fishing dock, and that's where we set up camp for the night. It was kind of cloudy, but it wasn't too bad. Josh and I were pretty excited about what adventure was in store for us. It could have been the excitement, or it could have been that my bivvy tent really didn't keep the water out, but Josh and I were both up around 5 in the morning, ready to get onto the river and paddle for the day. Despite our best efforts to keep our feet dry, we had to step into the frigid waters of the northern Delaware to get into our boats. As the rain was pouring, we set out on our adventure. Miles of untouched woodland and water above and below us lay ahead as we made our way toward Hancock, New York. Josh said the capstone of his trip would be to see a bald eagle. At one point, we stopped counting because we saw so many. We made it to Callicoon around 3 o'clock to have a quick lunch. There was a storm rolling in from the north. Josh was very optimistic that the storm would pass. But about 2 miles out of Callicoon, it hit, and it hit hard. We saw the rain sweep across the river. Lightning struck soon after. Josh and I pulled ashore, stood on our life vest under a tarp for about a half hour. After the storm died down, the river turned fast and muddy. We made it north of Narrowsburg, turned in for the night. As Josh and I tried to relax for the evening, the river had another plan, bring on another storm for the day, so we turned in for the night. When we woke up in the morning, we saw that the river rose at least 1 foot overnight. This was good news for us, seeing that the water was moving a lot faster. We paddled on, past Narrowsburg, and onto the great expanse before Port Jervis. The sun came out in the morning, and it was a welcome sight compared to all the storms we had the day before. Because the river was high, Josh and I encountered rapids that were larger than anything we've seen on the Lehigh. At one point, Josh gave out a roller coaster yell as the front half of his boat was out of the water, coming down off of a rapid north of Skinner's Falls.
Saturday sun came without warning.
We pulled into Port Jervis around 2 o'clock for an extended lunch. We already made our goal for the day, so any paddling beyond that would take away from tomorrow. Josh and I had a chance to stretch our legs, and we walked to the Little League baseball fields, where I was able to fill up my water bottles and then continue our trip. We made it into the Delaware Water Gap recreation area, and the water seemed to stop moving. For miles, it was just glass. We had the opportunity of seeing 2 eagles mate when they did their death drop from the sky. Josh and I started to grow desperate to find a campsite around 7:30 at night. After paddling 70 miles in 13 hours, we were a little weary. We saw that all the campsites along the river were taken. When we got to Site 95, 96, and 97, we saw the boats were parked in front. But 98 was open, so we took it, and it was pretty unfortunate. The group that was staying in Campsite 97 was loud, and they fired off an air horn at 1 o'clock in the morning. This disturbed my sleep, but Josh snored right through it.
Won't come and see me. above.
When we woke the next morning, the group in Campsite 97 found themselves with 2 boats and 1 paddle. We moved on that day, figuring we'd get to Easton around 6 o'clock. I figured the further south we moved along the river, the less rapids we would see. But that wasn't the case. By the Martin Creek power plant, Josh and I encountered a section of rapids that was maybe a half a mile long, that pushed our boat sideways, water came in from the back, and there was even a section of water that moved up the river. We arrived in Easton around 2 o'clock, which was well ahead of schedule. We finally had a chance to relax and just hang out on the river. We passed the Easton River stage where Josh and I performed years before. It was an odd sort of comfort seeing the Lehigh empty into the Delaware, knowing that the Lehigh is where I spend most of my time paddling. I said goodbye to Josh and Mel, and then I packed up all my gear, like a cartoon hobo, on the back of my paddles and carried it through Easton. I took it to Lauren's house, along with my boat, and left it out to dry. The creature comforts of having a shower, drinking water from the faucet, or putting on a dry shirt really meant a lot more now than it did a few days ago. Bright and early Monday morning, Lauren dropped me off at where the Delaware and Lehigh River meets in Easton. It was kind of fitting that the Lehigh River was sending me off on the rest of my trip. I had no idea as I started paddling that this would be the most interesting day of the entire trip. As the river got wider, houses replaced trees on the shore. There were less bald eagles, less geese, less ducks, and more homes that cost more than I would make in 3 lifetimes. I realized at this point in the trip all my estimated times of arrival would be off by a lot. I expected to get to New Hope around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I showed up at 12. I took an hour for lunch docking at the Bucks County Playhouse in New Hope. I stopped at John and Peter's for a drink and took a picture of the stage that I played on when I opened for Officer Roseland. After paddling out of New Hope, I knew there was a wing dam just south of the town. I asked the guy on the side of the river if the middle channel was still open, and he said yes, it wouldn't be a problem. I didn't realize how much of a problem it would have been. The rapids I encountered north of Narrowsburg and by Skinner's Falls were nothing compared to what I was about to go into. The middle channel was clear as the guy said, but I dropped about 5 feet down a very smooth rapid into the first one, and I was fine. But the second rapid was so close to the first that the entire cockpit of my boat was filled up. If not for my bulkheads being filled with air, my boat would have sunk to the bottom of the Delaware and my trip would have been over. I paddled my way through as best as I could, and no matter how much I tried to pour out of my boat, the little waves would put it all back in. At about a quarter mile later, I pulled off to the shore and emptied my boat. I realized that I lost my maps and I lost one of my water bottles. As I was paddling after emptying my boat, I was scouring the river looking for any kind of clues in my water bottle or my maps. I gave up, realizing I would just have one more water bottle and just follow the river and take it where it goes. But about a mile down the river, I saw this black object floating in the water. Sure enough, it was my water bottle. About a half a mile later, I also saw my maps floating. I was pretty hysterical because I was on my own and everything came back to me. After the trials and tribulations of the wing dam in New Hope, I made my way to Washington's Crossing Park. I figured I was already on the river and might as well take this time to paddle across like Washington did. When I got to the New Jersey side, I got out of my boat, asked a guy if he was German, he told me he was, so I punched him, yelled America, and made my way back to the boat. Just kidding, I didn't do that, but man, that would have been awesome if I did. I was still shaken up after the Wing Dam incident, and I knew Scudder's Falls was approaching. All the reports I read about Scudder's Falls said to take extreme caution, so I took the safest line I could possibly think of. When I had a chance to look back at the rapids and what people were talking about, I realized that those people have only seen rapids in the bathtub when their mother washed them. I had a chance to stop in my hometown of Yardley, Pennsylvania. I took a picture of the auto shop that took care of my truck after I got it stuck in the mud on a construction site. I went to Afton Pond and realized it was a lot smaller than I imagined when I was a kid. I continued to paddle on, past Morrisville, and even to Trenton, New Jersey. The last rapids I occurred were in Trenton, and that's the fall line. After that, I'll be dealing with the tides. I took a wrong turn out of Trenton, New Jersey and got stuck in some backwater. It took me about a half hour to fight the currents to get back out to the main river. Around 7 o'clock that night, I started to grow weary and wanted to find a place to camp. Up ahead in the distance, I saw a clearing in the woods of mowed lawn, and I didn't care if it was someone's home, I was going to sleep there. Well, it turned out it was someone's home. It was William Penn's. I walked the grounds of Pennsbury Manor, just like I did when I was in 3rd grade. And I saw peacocks, goats, a horse, a raccoon. At one point, a catbird attacked me. There was a skunk maybe 10 yards away from me, and a cat that stole one of my Cliff Bars that night. Several tugboats passed in the middle of the night going to the Tullytown landfill. I was surprised how much wake they kicked off. The next morning I left hours before any employee would arrive, and I made my way with the tide towards Philadelphia. My lighter was waterlogged after the incident in New Hope, so I was planning on stopping in Bristol to a convenience store to get a new one. I came upon a construction crew in the middle of the river and asked a gentleman for one. He gave me his lighter right there, some river magic. It was around this point that I saw Philadelphia in the distance. This was the most mentally taxing part of the trip, because no matter how much I paddled, the city never seemed to move any closer. I made pretty good time rolling with the current on the way to the city. At one point, I saw some waves in front of me, real small ones. I didn't realize that was the tide rolling back in. For the next 5 or 6 miles, I fought the current. I didn't realize it until I pulled ashore. As I waited for the tide at an abandoned pier next to the Coast Guard station, I realized I was urban camping while I was sleeping in my hammock looking at downtown Philadelphia. Since the tide was rolling out and I was well rested, I decided to paddle as far as I could. I made my way to Tinicum, Pennsylvania, where I stayed on a private dock. In Tinicum, there was a private bathroom that I could use to refill my waters, clean my utensils, and wash my face. I felt like $1,000,000. I unceremoniously made it to Delaware around 11 o'clock in the morning. This completed my goal of paddling the length of the Delaware along the Pennsylvania border. As the tide began to roll in, I pulled into Fox Point State Park, which is just north of Wilmington. I stayed there for the next 6 hours, eating food, drinking as much water as I could, and just relaxing, waiting for the tide. I realized I ran out of sunscreen, and a gentleman told me that there was a convenience store a mile away. I decided to take a nap, and I was going to head to that convenience store later. A half hour later, I heard a horn honking behind me. The gentleman had got me some new sunscreen. I left Fox Point at 6 o'clock, ready to ride the tide out again. I wasn't in any shipping lanes, and every once in a while I had to deal with a tugboat's wake. But at one point, a full tanker went by, and I decided to turn my boat with the waves that it was making. The first 2 waves were just fine. The third filled in my boat from the back, and I thought I was going to sink in the middle of the Delaware. The water was rough and choppy just north of the Delaware Memorial Bridge. I kept telling myself, just past that bridge, things will get easier. And oddly enough, they did. I don't know how, I don't know why. But I was rolling with the current, and the water was as smooth as glass. There were no tankers in sight, and I was able to cross the bay twice. At 11 o'clock at night, I saw that there was a storm rolling in from the west with a lot of lightning. I decided to make a run for it to Fort Delaware. I pulled up on its dock, pulled my boat up, locked it into place, and took the bare essentials onto its pier under a pavilion. Although the pictures really don't show it, the gibbous moon was blood red as the storm clouds rolled in. I found out later that Fort Delaware was haunted. This was the perfect storm, literally and figuratively, for me to be scared out of my mind. But if I wasn't so exhausted, I probably wouldn't have slept that night. But I slept like a baby. The next morning at sunrise, I gave myself a quick tour of Fort Delaware, and the mosquitoes gave themselves a quick tour of my face. I paddled with the tide and pulled up along a shore to eat some lunch. It was at this point that my water filter stopped working. It's not that it didn't work, it's just it doesn't filter out briny water. I made it to Woodland Beach, Delaware around 1 o'clock and went scouring the town to find somebody who could give me water. I eventually found a gentleman who let me get water from his hose, but the water from the hose was still pretty salty. I used that water very sparingly. While in Woodland Beach, I met Larry, who works for the Delaware Division of Fish and Wildlife. He was checking out the electricity of the fishing pier. We started to talk about my trip. He gave me a lot of maps and information about what to expect as I traveled further down the Delaware. He then offered me his phone so I could make calls to Lauren, my folks, and Josh to let them know that I was safe. Around 5 o'clock, a storm started to roll in from the northeast. I decided to paddle out of town to get a little jump on it. It was about this time that my camera became waterlogged and died. I guess Adventure Proof really doesn't hold up for Pentax. The storm lasted for about 4 hours, and there were several waves that came in from the side that nearly sunk my boat. As the waves would crash against the seagrass, I saw bald eagles hanging out on sandbars, herons flying by, and horseshoe crabs washed up on shore. When the storm was over, the sky opened up to a deep blue. In the horizon, I couldn't tell where the water ended and the sky began if it wasn't for a tanker in the way. I pulled into Pickering, Delaware for the night. The gentleman I met on the beach filled both my water bottles and gave me 2 extra water bottles. Pickering is just east of the Dover Air Force Base, so throughout the night the cargo planes would do their touch-and-go practices and fly overhead. If you ever wonder where mosquitoes go on vacation, they go to Pickering, Delaware. I took off my shirt for 2 minutes and I had 40 mosquito bites on my back, at the very least. I could hear the mosquitoes buzzing past my head, past the hammock, past my sleeping bag, and the towel that I slept on. I paddled with the sun and the tide until I reached Bowers, Delaware. There I met several people who were collecting fossils on the shore. They gave me some of their favorites, and they said, "Enjoy the rest of your adventure." I set my hammock up underneath the house, thinking that it was abandoned. As I was packing up, turns out it wasn't abandoned, and the homeowner came home with their dogs. I paddled along the coast until I reached Broadkill Beach. Along the way, I accidentally hit a cow-nosed stingray. It was right in the middle of my paddle path, and I couldn't stop it. That night, I pulled into Broadkill Beach, Delaware. I went through the town looking for some hoses to get some water, when I ran into a lady who was walking up their steps and having a little bit of trouble. I asked her if she needed help, and she didn't, but we started to exchange stories, and it turns out she had a connection to the Lehigh Valley. She invited me in and gave me water. That night, I had a huge meal and relaxed knowing that my trip was close to over because I could see the lighthouse at Cape Henlopen. Around 7 o'clock that morning, I decided to pack up. I didn't pack up very quickly, knowing that I only had 7 miles to get to the ocean, and 7 miles was nothing compared to the amount of miles that I was putting on the past week. As I paddled, I saw stingray in the water. I even saw some porpoise. As I got closer to the ocean, the currents got a little more unpredictable. It was as if the Atlantic was pushing in to see what was going on, while all the water from Deposit, from Port Jarvis, from the Water Gap, from the Lehigh River was pushing out to be free into the ocean. My boat got pushed around for a while, but I eventually made it through. I paddled a bit down the shore and put my feet in the water. I returned the shell that Lauren gave me and grabbed a new one for her, and grabbed one for myself too, knowing that my trip was done.